Hi, welcome to Voting for Change. I'm Eleanor Vannan.
And I'm Jake Harrigan. Here on today's episode of Voting for Change, we're going to be talking about real people, real politics, and what's happening with the referendum that's going to be coming up.
Now, our segment typically will be conversations with academics, politicians, other students, all about how to be better educated in terms of this upcoming referendum. Now, a little bit of my backstory. I'm currently a political science student, but I went back to education a little bit later in life.
Why did you choose to go back and get educated again?
Well, when I was younger, I went to college straight after high school, and I tried this or that, but nothing really lit a fire for me. So I decided, why am I wasting this money? I don't know what I want to do. I should go work. So I worked, I waitressed, I worked in real estate. I eventually had enough, and I thought, you know what, maybe now I'm ready. And I went back and I took a political science course as an elective, and in that course, it got me going in a way that I hadn't found I was in relationship to education, and it changed the way I looked at a lot of things. Now, I think I'm very typical of my generation.
How so?
Well, I voted. I felt I always had to vote, but when it came to voting, I was kind of apathetic. You go, you pick a name. Does it really matter? Probably not.
I gotta say, there's probably a lot of people who find themselves in the same boat as you.
Oh yeah, I think it's really common, and for me it was, there was an aspect of duty. You have to do it.
Right.
But how much time do you want to put into it? Does it matter? No. And when I found political science, and I actually started to know how the systems worked and the history behind a lot of the systems, and even as a woman, my own right to vote, it changed something. I felt my relationship to civic activities was different. And so for me, I'd like to give people that opportunity to learn more, because I think, honestly, if you do learn a little bit more, you're going to want to be involved in the process.
Right, which brings us to the purpose of the segment of this show, which is to get people talking in some way or another about education when it comes to their political rights and the upcoming election referendum on electoral reform.
Now, Jake, how did you get interested in this, in politics in general, or the reform, the referendum in particular?
Well, it all started for me, I remember, when it was my first time voting. I was there at the ballots, and I had to make the decision. And I still remember that moment when I was there, thinking, well, do I vote for where my heart is, or do I vote for someone who has a chance of actually winning and making an impact? And for me, it was that moment where I needed to decide between voting the way I wanted to and a way that I considered strategic. That, for me, was where I got thinking, well, maybe there's something different, another way of doing this, another way of conducting our elections. And that's what got me interested in, first of all, learning more about our political systems, and secondly, and this is going on later, into civic engagement, getting people aware, getting people active and caring, and just talking about it with their friends and family, because that's a lot of the way that people get educated nowadays.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you bring up strategic voting. I personally think that does a lot of damage to civic engagement and civic pride. If you're compromising yourself on who you're voting for, sure, it's not a person you hate, but it's not a person you love. It just sours you on the process.
Well, exactly, and you become disillusioned at that point, right? Well, what's the point in going out and voting if it's not someone that you really want?
Absolutely, and I think, regardless of the voting system, better education helps people understand that. I think strategic voting is, even under the current system, something that can be fixed with a little bit of education. Knowing more about the systems and about your candidates, I think, can give people the confidence to vote their conscience.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And with the referendum coming up, now is there's no better time than right now to get educated, to get the kind of knowledge that you need to be able to make a decision. Because coming up soon, sometime before November the 30th this year, you are going to have to make a decision. There's going to be a mail-in ballot, and you're going to need to say whether you want your voting system to stay the same or to change.
And it's a very historic referendum as well for British Columbia. We've had two before, but they were system-specific referendums. Now, it's very likely that's not the case with this referendum. We've heard a lot of people arguing that it should be about the principle. Do we want to stay with what we currently have, or are residents of BC behind the principle of proportional representation?
Right, and that is what we are going to be talking about on this and the rest of the shows is proportional representation, which for everyone at home is not a specific system, but it's more of an umbrella term to talk about systems that transfer the way that we vote into power in a different way than our current system does.
It is. It's essentially just the principle that how people vote should in some way be reflected. It shouldn't be a Majorian system.
Right.
Now, I know a lot of people talk about change, and change is scary. Like I personally, I don't like change.
What's new is always a little bit scarier than what you have right now.
But I think we kind of need to look at our history with change in particular. You know, I'm a woman of a certain age, so I'm quite happy to say I'm a feminist. And for me, one of the biggest things is that I have the right to vote.
Exactly.
And it wasn't given to me. It was fought for by a lot of other women. And when we talk about tradition, and there's tradition behind the system, and that's why we shouldn't change it because it's worked so well, there was tradition behind women not voting.
Absolutely.
And
it was
so,
a huge call. It was a huge, hold against it. Well, it's not the way that we've done things. It's not the way that we've ever done things. So why would we make the change?
Exactly. And I think we need to look at the actual arguments behind each individual system instead of closing the conversation down as soon as someone says, well, this is how it's always been done, so that's good enough.
No, exactly. You need to move beyond a basic call to tradition, right? That's the logical fallacies, that it's the way that we've always done it, so we should basically continue doing that forever and always.
Well, and even within BC, I mean, our current electoral system is not the only system BC's ever used. So that argument that it's traditionally been the case needs some adjusting when looking at the history.
Exactly. You cannot take this into account just the way it is and say, we've always done it this way, because that's not even true.
Now, when it comes to average people, I mean, we're both poli-sci nerds, so
guilty.
So yeah, I know we have a different approach to some of the boring policy aspects. But what do you hope we can give to the viewers at home? How can we give them some information or some education that they might otherwise be missing?
Well, more than anything, I hope that people can come away from the show and coming towards the election just with a basic sense of understanding about the values and the feelings that you can get from the different systems. You don't need to walk away with an understanding of the exact math of it. And as a good friend of mine said, you don't need to know exactly how an airplane works to get on and fly in it. But you do need to know that it's going to get you to where you need to go. So for me, that's going to be one of the most important things throughout this referendum, is just engaging with people and making sure that they have a real idea about what we're talking about, or what people, politicians, their friends and families are talking about going forward.
Well, exactly, and I think this referendum is such a great opportunity. No matter what the outcome is, the people of British Columbia are getting a chance to say what they believe in. Exactly. That doesn't happen every day, and it's such a great and somewhat unique opportunity that I think we do have a bit of a duty to educate ourselves, whether it's, reading the news or
even just going on YouTube and watching some videos about the ways that we vote. I know that there's some great videos that use animal kingdoms to demonstrate the way you do, the way that you can vote, and the way that different voting systems that are being proposed, the way that they work. It can be as simple as that, and that's all it takes to start a small conversation.
Well, and one of my personal favorite things is reading the news from countries, especially the political news from countries that have different systems.
Oh, exactly. We're better to draw inspiration from than places that already use systems that are being proposed.
Exactly, and you know, if it's one thing to talk about things in theory, when you see it actually in practice and things are getting done, it's a great example to see how well other systems can work, or, you know, compare it to how things are getting done in our current system.
No, that's definitely a fair point. There is a wealth of examples to draw from internationally. And I should mention, not all of these countries have always had PR systems.
No.
A lot of them, people are going to be talking a lot about New Zealand, which is a country that changed to a PR system around 1993-95. They had several referendums, for the record, just like BC. So looking around the world, there's a lot of places to learn from, and I really hope that people take this opportunity to reach out and educate themselves.
Well, and also, I think one of the important things people can do is make lists of qualities they want to see in their electoral system. Do you want a system that promotes fairness, equality, diversity? There are all different aspects, and different systems have different outcomes. So certainly knowing what you look for in your political institutions can give you a great indicator for what system you want to be using.
Exactly. But only when you're educated about what you want can you make a good decision. And so that definitely needs to be the first step moving forward.
Now, Jake, with our future interviews, what's one thing you'd really like to have people answer?
Well, let me think about that. I think one thing that I'd really like to hear people talk about is what they most are looking forward to changing from our current system. Because first past the post, the system that we have right now is far from perfect. There's a lot of ways that I think we could grow or improve from it. That doesn't mean that necessarily we should change. But I want to hear from some of our speakers coming in about what points they think we could really stand to improve about our current system, and then hear their proposals for what we could do to fix that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things I'm really looking forward to is hearing from people from very different backgrounds, not just academics, not just politicians, but everyday residents of BC, because there is really a swell in BC, a grassroots movement who are asking for change. And I think it will be interesting to see why people are so motivated for this particular political issue when otherwise they may not be that politically involved.
Definitely. I think one of the interesting things about electoral reform is that it's not just one issue, but it impacts the way that decisions are made across the board. So you've got people who are interested in environmental issues, you've got people interested in financial issues, and this issue of voting reform touches on all of that because it's going to affect the way that decisions get made in the future. So I think because of that, that might be part of the reason that we're seeing this widespread grassroots movement of people who are very vocal one way or another.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the fascinating things for me as a student of politics is that it's a non-party specific issue. You have people from every party, from the left to the right, who all want this change or are advocating for this change. I think it's going to be interesting to hear where they're coming from, why people with such different political ideologies want to move in the same direction. I think that's a really fascinating conversation.
It is an interesting phenomenon where people across the aisle tend to get together. It's not something you see very often. And not to say there's unanimity among the population of BC, but we're definitely seeing movement across the party lines.
And that's a great thing. I mean, I think most people would say they want government to work together better.
And work for them.
And work for them. And I think when you see that reaching across, that compromise, that collaboration, that's a good indication that things are going to be done for the people.
This is definitely an issue that is at its heart something not for a political party in particular, but for the people.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, ultimately, it's something being given to the people. It's an increase in their vote as individuals. So I think it's not surprising, but it's really nice to see that coming together of people who you may not see doing that all the time.
No, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to the coming months, and I'm hoping to see a lot of good discourse, a lot of good, clean discourse between the parties about this going forward.
I'm looking forward to it. I think it could be a really positive experience for British Columbians, and it's certainly going to be a great opportunity for some education. I think you're never too old to learn a little bit more, and we live in a great province. I mean, I'm really happy to be a BCer.
Oh, me too.
So anytime I can learn more about this place I call home, I'm pretty happy that I get that opportunity.
Exactly, and any chance that I can take to make it better, I'm going to take that. And I think that's something that a lot of people really, really feel the same about. They love this place that we call home. They don't want to make a decision that takes it a step backwards. But again, that's why education is so important, so people can feel confident going forward up until the referendum that they are making the choice, one way or another, that they feel is the best for the province.
Oh, absolutely. I think when you increase civic engagement and you give people that level of education, people are going to do what's best for this province, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that happen.
Me as well.
Well, Jake, it's been really great talking to you.
It's been fantastic being here on this segment.
I look forward to our future shows. We've got a great crew here at Shaw, and we really appreciative for the airtime. We're really appreciative to have them working and all the help we've had. And I think it's time that we say goodbye for now.
All right, goodbye, and see you next time on Voting for Change. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.
We have a diverse, vibrant population here in British Columbia, and in fact right across Canada. And it strikes me that the best way to have representative government is to ensure that the diversity of the community is reflected in the institutions that we use to function our democracy. And the first past the post system, save for one election in 2001, has always seen a minority group of votes get an absolute majority of the power. They call it seats, but at the end of the day, it's power. And I believe that power sharing is a better way for us to proceed as a society, and the way we get to that power sharing is bringing in a new form of electoral discussion, and that's where I want to move towards proportional representation.
Hello, my name is Laurel Collins, and along with my co-host Michael Prince, we will be hosting this segment of Voting for Change. Today we have as our guest David Merner, who is on the Council for Fair Vote Canada. In November, the public will be asked to choose between a proportional representation system or the current system of first past the post. Fair Vote Canada has been advocating for change. Why do you think change is necessary?
We think that we can do much better than our current system. Our current system has a lot of flaws to it. One of them is that it sometimes generates wrong winners. In other words, one party will get more votes than another, but the other party will form the government, which doesn't seem fair. Also, in our system, voters are typically not voting for anybody who gets elected. Over 50% of British Columbians in the last provincial election voted for candidates who didn't get elected. In proportional representation systems, you can do much better than that. Sometimes 95% of voters will vote for somebody who actually gets elected. So in our democracy, we're saying there are much better ways of electing our members of the Legislative Assembly, and that's what we're working for.
Proportional representation has often resulted in coalition governments. Can you describe some of the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, some people say that it makes forming a government more difficult, which is true. In some countries like Germany recently, it's taken months to form a government. But we say that that's a healthy process. It's much healthier to have our politicians and political leaders working together, finding compromise, figuring out what's in the public interest. And you see that in BC right now. There's some controversy around the current government, but it's working. We have two leaders of political parties who have come to a compromise and have made it work. And it looks like it'll probably work for 4 years. So you look at the evidence in British Columbia, and even look at the worst case scenarios like Germany, the elected leaders do figure out how to come together and govern in proportional systems, but critics will say it takes longer. Yes, that's true. It does. Compromise sometimes takes longer.
What about the criticism you've no doubt heard many times, David, about it gives a third party, like in this case in BC, the Green Caucus, a disproportionate amount of influence, that they won 3 seats, about 17% of the popular vote. Some people would say they're the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah.
They've got much more clout than perhaps they even deserve. So what's thoughts on that?
Again, look at BC and you look at some of the decisions the NDP government has made around Site C. Very unpopular with Greens, very unpopular with the Green Caucus, and yet they were able to go ahead and make that decision. So the tail wagging the dog argument certainly doesn't hold true in British Columbia. There are some countries, I think, perhaps Israel is a good example, where they have unusual proportional representation rules. And it is possible, for example, in Israel, for small religiously based parties to hold sort of disproportionate power. But nobody in Canada is arguing we should adopt Israel's system or Italy's system. We're saying, look at Germany or look at the Scandinavian countries. They have very good systems, often with a threshold. You have to get 5% of the vote in order to get a seat in the national legislature. We're saying that's the kind of, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, those are the kind of countries we should be looking to, not Israel or Italy.
So I can pick up on that 5%, because I no doubt we're going to be hearing over the coming months as the referendum heats up about fringe parties. And does moving to a proportional representation is going to invite everybody out of the woodwork and the forests of BC to, we already have multiple parties running elections. Many of them only get 500 votes, 1,000 votes, maybe a few thousand votes. But what about that as a concern, that this is going to fragment the party system or complicate it and encourage what some people call one-issue parties or fringe parties into the process?
I think there is some basis for that. For example, I think it's likely that the provincial Liberals will probably fragment. I see conservatives, true conservatives, actually forming their own party and getting seats in the legislature. So I see that as possible. But the idea that extremist parties will take over, I don't think that's realistic in our political culture. Even in sort of Germany or in the Netherlands, where they do actually have some fringe political support, the extremist parties are really marginalized, and they don't form government. They never form government. Contrast that with the United States, where we have a fellow who's the president of the United States, who many would characterize as extremist, really outside the American political culture. And he was able to grab power by taking over one of the mainstream parties, the Republican Party, which is really struggling with its identity now, right?
Absolutely.
So I would say there's much more danger around extremist takeovers in first-past-the-post systems. We see it in south of the border.
We are a number of months out from the referendum, and we haven't really heard what the ballot question is going to be. What's your take on what it might be? What's kind of your preference?
I don't know what it'll be, but my sense is that a very clear and clean question is something that will appear to be more fair. From an activist point of view, from a proportional representation activist point of view, I'd love a very simple question that, do you want change or do you want the same old broken system? But I don't think they're going to go with that. I think they're
slightly loaded wording there, David.
The other thing is whether they have one or two questions, right? We talked about that earlier, and I think that it might be a good idea to have more than one question. Say one on a high level, fair question, do you want a change? But then I think it's inevitable that we'll have to get into some of the details, and I think you will in future shows, around what kind of system would you vote for? And then give British Columbians a chance to vote on the various different systems. I think that makes sense to me. It sounds fair to me, and it'll give some guidance to the legislators who will have to decide which system to pick. So my personal preference, and I think from just media reports, the government might be interested in going this way, is having a two-question referendum.
You touched a little bit on the complexity issue. That's one of the biggest critiques from the kind of no side you often hear, is that proportional representation is complicated, that voters don't understand it. This is going to be our third referendum. What's your response to the complication issue?
Again, over 80% of OECD countries, developed countries, have proportional representation. Ireland, Malta, we mentioned already, Germany, and so on. And those voters can figure out how to vote in those countries. I'm sure British Columbians are just as smart as the Irish or the Maltese or the Germans, right? We should be able to figure it out. I think our standard line in the proportional representation community is, well, when you get in the car, you don't necessarily know how the internal combustion engine functions, you just know how to turn on the key. So for voters, the key is, how do you get this system? How do you vote in the system? And that's not complicated. The other thing is, critics will say, well, counting the ballots can be complicated, and there's some truth in that. Complicated, especially in a preferential ballot where you're marking 1, 2, 3, 4, right? In some of the systems, there's some truth to the fact that it is complicated, but it's also true that you have experts running the counts. You have political party activists who are there scrutinizing the count. You have BC elections folks who are running the count. So we have systems in place to deal with the complications of counting ballots. So I'm not really concerned, and I think it's a little bit unfair to say, oh, it'll be confusing. Others figure it out, we can figure it out.
So how do you hope to see the campaign, whether for one side or the other, play out this summer? We had the Premier a few weeks ago saying he didn't quite frankly think people would be talking much about electoral reform or proportional representation. They'd be much happier around the summer barbecues than talking about this. I think they can do both, barbecue and talk about politics. But how do you hope, what's your kind of best scenario that you see playing out over the next 3 or 4 or 5 months?
Well, one of the things about the proportional representation advocates that I work with is they're on the ground now. We actually have a lot of very grassroots people who care about this stuff and will go out and knock on doors. My sense of the no side is that they're not really grassroots oriented. They're funded by large corporations. They don't have the same ground game that we do on the yes side. And so my strong sense is that there's an advantage to getting the information out early, getting the questions out early. For us, we want to get out there. We want to celebrate Canada Day with large yes banners and march and parades and that kind of stuff. So I am hoping the government moves on it, that it doesn't delay, as the Premier said, until after the summer. I think that would be handing the no side a real advantage, actually.
So British Columbians can expect to see the likes of you and others out across the province at various summer fairs and exhibitions and other kinds of recreational activities.
With our information booths and also knocking on doors. We've been knocking on doors for several months already, and people don't know that an election is coming. So we see it as partly our job to get out there, inform people, hey, a referendum is coming, and it's going to really determine the future of British Columbia in terms of how our politics shapes up.
You mentioned funding, and that the different sides are going to be funded potentially by people outside of BC or by the government. Can you explain to our viewers a little bit how the funding works for both campaigns?
The rules haven't been finally set yet at the time of this interview, and we should be hearing more within weeks. But it's generally understood that there will be public funding for both sides, the yes side and the no side. And there will also be some restrictions on funding by outside organizations like Fair Vote Canada, so that there's a level playing field. One of the problems in BC politics in the past has been massive funding by corporations and unions on either sides of these issues. And so I understand the plan is, and you might know more about this than I do, Michael, to have a level playing field so there's roughly equal funding for both sides. To me, that sounds like it's fair.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Well, I think the whole credibility of this will be if people buy into it as an even-handed. I mean, there's been some controversy as well about the threshold of support, that it's not going to be 60 or 65%, that the government's saying 50% plus one. So I guess for you, part of that has to be the turnout. You've got to get a big voter turnout to make this seen as a credible, clear statement by citizens across the province.
Well, it's ironic because politicians often say, and actually the Premier of Prince Edward Island recently said this, they had a referendum on proportional representation. The yes side won, we want change. And he said, well, there was a relatively small turnout. But of course, if you compare the turnout in referenda to turnout in municipal election, even provincial elections, federal elections, often the turnout in those elections is very disappointing as well, right? And so politicians will say, well, in referenda we need high turnout, but in our own elections it's okay if there's low turnout, which seems a little bit unfair. The other thing is, first past the post, the academics who've studied these issues have shown that first past the post tends to depress turnout. There's an academic from California, Aaron Lipkart, who I'm sure you know, has found that roughly 6 or 7% advantage in terms of turnout for proportional representation countries. So one of the reasons for bringing in proportional representation, we say, is it increases turnout, it increases voter engagement because people's votes actually really do count to elect somebody. And so that's one of the pitches we make. Turnout is important. And proportional representation systems tend to have better turnout.
And that gives hence again the summer campaign. And even so for you, the campaign must have truly started months ago now.
It did. It started months ago. We've been knocking on doors. It's largely an information campaign at this point, trying to hear from people what they care about. And so we hear different things. Women are saying to us, what can we do about the underrepresentation of women? People in minority communities and other communities are saying, you know, this isn't really relevant to us, or we're talking about why proportional representation makes our democratic process more relevant. So those are the kinds of conversations we're having on the doorstep.
You mentioned that you've started this campaign already. How is this going to differ from previous referendum campaigns?
We've looked back at that. We've looked at lessons learned from the yes side campaigns. One of the things that we're great at is people like me love talking about the technical details of STV and MMP and all this alphabet soup of different systems, right? And we've learned from difficult experience that actually voters want to know more practical things like, what's this going to do for me? What's this going to do in terms of environmental policy? What's this going to do for the representation of women? What's the evidence around balanced budget and fiscally responsible government? And so they don't really actually want to know that much about the details. They want to know about how is this going to help them as citizens, right? And there's a really good story to tell. I mean, you look at the academic work that's been done on this, women are better represented in PR systems, and even Afghanistan, with its difficult cultural issues, has better representation of women in their parliament than we do. We have 26%. They're way ahead of us, right? Sweden has the best at 45% women, and they're a PR country as well. So those are the kinds of conversations we have is, what are you interested in as a voter, and how does that fit with our current system as opposed to a new system? So those are we're trying to shift the conversation because we've learned from past failure that talking about, you know, the statistics of preferential ballot voting is a really good way to lose a referendum.
Well, you get lost in the details really quickly.
Easily.
I think you're right. I think one of our hopes over the coming segments is to talk about the principles, you know, what's at stake in terms of value choices. And also, as you just said, the outcomes or the consequences. What might a change mean for people in terms of their connection to a local MLA, the sense of accountability? You know, will it be just forever coalition governments or minority governments? What might that mean for budgets and, as you say, fiscal responsibility? Depending on people's own values, they'll project or they'll want to investigate what it might mean for what is near and dear to them.
The values point is an excellent point. People really, I think Canadian values are much more about cooperation, working together. And so, of course, when we're campaigning on the doorstep, we emphasize the values conversation. And I think that is very important. People are turned off by the adversarial, tear down your opponent approach that we've seen with not just south of the border with the sort of toxic politics there, but also more and more in Canada. And I think you know, the Stephen Harper approach to attack the enemy politics has really, I think, tainted our system. And we saw that in Justin Trudeau's Sunny Ways approach. And I think a lot of citizens in BC and Canada generally are saying, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And that's what we're hoping to
You're
offer.
hoping third time the charm with a referendum in BC, I guess.
That's exactly right. We've learned from our lessons. We've learned lessons from the past. Now let's build a much more sort of positive, values-based, this is going to be better for you in these ways kind of campaign.
You touched on PEI and kind of the backtracking that happened. The federal Liberals also backtracked on their promise for proportional representation. do you have some certainty that if this referendum goes through, that the current coalition government between the NDP or the
Greens,
that they'll actually follow through on?
I think it would be very, very hard to backtrack. I think in this context where both of the major parties, both of the governing parties, the Greens and the NDP, committed during the election campaign to this, it would be very hard, I think, to back away. And I think the Greens will hold the NDP accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think. Well, I think there's going to be national attention on this. I think, as you know, you're part of a national organization. There's going to be a lot of interest across other provinces. PEI is committed to another referendum too, I understand. So they'll be doing another try at this. But there'll be other jurisdictions that'll be looking. New Brunswick did talk about it some years back, but then kind of cooled off on it as well. Ontario. So.
We're not an opportunity for BC to lead the way nationally. It really is.
Well, absolutely. And engage. I noticed, unlike, say, Scotland, which lowered the voting age and allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to engage in this, we're sticking with our standard voting age. But do you see this as a chance to reach out to younger people who aren't even going to get a chance to vote?
Yeah,
on this one,
I think it's a chance for young people. It's a chance for women. It's going to be a big change if it comes through.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
So I think that's all the time we have.
Okay. So thank you for watching our first segment of this series on voting for change. Laurel and I want to thank our guest.
Thanks.
David, thank you much for helping us open up what we hope to be a series of conversations and community dialogue. And as you can gather from this show, we're going to try to stay at a higher level of values and some of the big choices and some of the consequences that mean something to you as British Columbians. Thank you for watching.
Hello, my name is Kalen Harris, and welcome to another segment of Voting for Change. Joining me today is Stephen Hurdle, a bit of an expert in the field of proportional systems as an electoral system, so we're really happy to have him here to have the conversation about potentially a little bit of the systems. So, Stephen, you want to introduce yourself? Let us know who you are and how you come to be here today.
Yeah, my name's Stephen Hurdle, and I'm a researcher with Fair Vote Canada. And I've been involved in electoral reform movement for about a decade now, and I've learned a lot about systems and learned a lot of things that really surprised me, and a few things that didn't surprise me as much. But it's a very interesting topic, and I think it's a very important topic.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, we've learned a few things recently about the direction and the timeline of the electoral reform referendum that's coming up in the fall. David Eby just let the NDP supporters know that the announcement around a question is coming up fairly quickly. So before we get into that though, let's talk about what we've got now as far as a system, because I think there's a lot of people out there that don't necessarily understand what first past the post is when they hear that. So could you kind of briefly break down what first past the post system is and what it looks like right now?
First past the post is the system that we currently use to elect people in our provincial elections and our federal elections. It's called first past the post because you don't need a majority to win. You could win with a relatively small chunk of the vote. The current federal government was elected with under about 39% of the vote, I think it was.
Yeah, that's about right.
And that gave them 55% of the seats, and it gave them all of the power. And so the 61% of people who didn't vote for the current federal government aren't getting what they asked for.
Now, that 61%, is that even, that's only those who actually voted, because what was the turnout this last federal election?
Yeah, it was up a little bit, but it's still below 2/3.
Right.
Yeah, it's still not, it's not even as high as it was when I was a kid first watching elections on TV, not really understanding what they were at the time.
Right, so let's put it, what does the ballot look like? Is it, it's fairly straightforward, right? It's just a matter of marking your X on the ballot, right?
Well, that's the theory, but I'm not sure that that's the practice anymore. I think if you asked a bunch of people how our current system works, that they'd have a hard time explaining it to you. How does Justin Trudeau, for example, in that federal election example, get all of the power when almost, more than 60% of people didn't vote for him? How does he become the prime minister when he only got a few tens of thousands of votes in one riding in Quebec? there are additional considerations that people are looking at when they vote now. They're looking at things like, well, I like candidate A, but candidate B is more likely to win my riding, but candidate C represents a party that's more likely to win, and candidate D is the party I really don't want to win. So it creates this confusing mess that I think is making first past the post possibly the most complicated system that you could have.
Right, so that's where people complain about strategic voting, is that
right.
You're not actually clear on who you actually want to vote
Yep.
because you're doing all of this weird arithmetic.
That's right, and I know people in the most recent few elections who have voted for people that they didn't want to because they feared another result, and the person they voted for also didn't win. And so the strategic choices they're making are in many cases aren't playing out for them. And I think this is leading to, so they didn't get to vote for who they wanted to, and they made a compromise choice, and that didn't work out for them either. And so I think this is creating growing confusion and growing disenchantment with our system.
It makes sense. I mean, if you think you go to cast a ballot and the likelihood that your ballot doesn't actually count is fairly high. I mean, it's 2 to 1 almost.
Yeah.
It would seem to be pretty frustrating to most people, right?
I think it is frustrating most people,
right.
And I think that's one of the reasons why we're having referendum after referendum. People aren't quite sure what they want yet, but the majority of them are really clear they don't like what we have. So something has to give, right?
Right, and so I mean, like I think it's true of a lot of people, especially in Victoria, that they are tired of the system that is. I mean, I've personally spoken to a lot of people who are still pretty happy with first past the post as far as the system because it's something that's familiar. They know how it's supposed to work. Is there any reason why first past the post is a good thing that brings people to support them as strongly as they do?
The advantages of first past the post are eroding with every election. Again, back to the example of more and more people feeling like they need to vote strategically. So the first past the post is getting worse with time, not better with time. And so it's there. Perhaps in the pre-information age, there is a defense for it because the counting is so simple. But what you now have is a simple system to count, but a system that's hard to go to the ballot box and to use for many people because it doesn't give you a real choice.
Right.
It doesn't give you a choice where you can go and select what you want and have confidence that that's the right thing to do. So that's not a good system if people are being forced to vote for something other than what they want.
Right, and I mean, I think often it results in a first or second choice, right? Like you either have the winner or you're voting for the person that's most likely to oust them, I guess, right?
That's increasingly what it's becoming.
Yeah.
It's I see as much of a push at elections now to don't vote for so and so.
Right.
When I was a kid, I don't remember seeing signs saying don't vote for so and so. I now see that a lot.
Right.
And so that's a big change.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess that kind of brings us to the next question. If we have first past the post that forces people to make choices that they don't necessarily like. Yes, it's simple looking because the ballot's fairly straightforward, and I guess at the end of the day, you know what you're getting at the end of the election night. There's no wiggle room in the back end of things, I guess, except for all the wiggle room is up front. Now we're trying to do the math ahead of time, which of course doesn't work.
Yeah.
So then what's the systems, we've just heard, like I said, from David Eby, or the NDP, that David Eby is likely to announce within the next few weeks what the question will be in the fall mail-in ballot referendum. So let's kind of talk us through some of the potential systems that we're going to see. Probably maybe just one or two of the likely systems that we're going to see on the ballot in the fall.
I think we're likely to see some form of STV. It may not be called that.
Okay, so STV stands for?
STV stands for Single Transferable Vote.
Okay.
It is the one that the previous two referendums was on.
Right.
In that sense, it's the incumbent option. Many people in British Columbia passionately support STV because there's a lot of education around it in the past two referendums. So if we see multiple options, it's almost certain to be one of the options.
Okay.
The thing that is really good about STV, I think, that it is that, you know, it's dead simple voting. You go and there's a list of candidates, and you say, I like this candidate the best, this candidate second best, this candidate third best, and yet the way it's counted, it's a proportional result. And independent candidates can contest every single seat. That's another strength of STV.
Okay. And how would you frame the conversations around STV in the previous two referendums that were fought over it? Like, where were the pros and cons in the 2005 election referendum and the 2009 referendum, and what were the strengths and weaknesses?
Well, I think we touched a bit on some of the strengths there, and in that independents can be really empowered under STV, and it also might make candidates or parties a little more independently minded. We see that in some jurisdictions where it's used, and STV has a reputation for forcing elected members to spend a bit more time in their constituencies, working with the community. That's something that it has a reputation for. It has the strength that everyone is, you know, running in a specific geographic area, and that's really, really good for STV. STV won the first referendum by any reasonable measure.
Right.
You know, about 58% of people said, I want STV over first past the post in that first referendum.
So what would you say is the reason why the threshold was put at 60% then?
Well, it's kind of a funny thing, you know, 58% wasn't enough to win, but that meant 42% was enough for it to lose.
But why? Like, I mean, maybe I'm asking you to, you know, play political strategist or whatever. But like, what?
The government of the day chose to put it at 60%, and whatever their political calculus was, they wanted it to, you know. The argument is maybe there were some people in the government who didn't want it to succeed, but hard to say.
Right. Okay, so STV is likely something that we'll see in the fall. What about, there's MMP systems, right?
Yeah, that's the other one I expect to see.
And MMP stands for? Mixed
Member Proportional.
Okay.
It also has some significant strengths.
Right.
One of the things that's interesting about it too is that there's the opportunity for creating a made-in BC version of it.
Oh, cool.
It's not any one thing. There are different ways to design these.
Right. So then when people come up and say MMP is horrible because
of some example they heard about on social media, yeah.
Right. So it means that they're not necessarily speaking truths.
I think they're speaking something they believe to be true, but that there's maybe more to the story, because what's clever about MMP is that it allows you to cast a vote for a local person, but also cast a regional vote as well. So the way MMP would be done in BC is very different than the way you see it in Germany and other places, I think, because the way all the advocates are talking about, and the only way I can reasonably expect the government to do it is to say, break it down by region, so that you would never have someone from Vancouver representing Fort St. John. You know that, and so I expect them to break it down that way, so that you'll have some people that elected in the traditional way in ridings, and others that will be represent regions of the province. You know, maybe Southern Vancouver Island, you know, perhaps the Okanagan. You know, that kind of size of region.
So I think that you get a lot of conversation about MMP being not well. They focus they put too much power in the hands of parties. So is that something that can also be tinkered with in order to improve the system, or is that just something we're stuck with?
Nope, it can. I would say our current system gives too much power to the parties, or at least gives a lot of power to the parties. Let's put it that way, because the parties, can make you jump through hoops for them to get the nomination, and especially if it's a safe seat, that's very important. And they can use that power over their existing elected members. If they want to run for re-election, they have to toe the party line. So
the notion of a safe seat isn't something that you hear a lot of in proportional systems.
No.
The fact that that we have in regions across BC people who virtually go uncontested in a democratic society and are held virtually completely unaccountable simply because they've got a certain bent to the region that they represent. That seems questionable.
One of the biggest weaknesses of our current system, far and away, is the idea of safe seats.
Right.
So if you're a riding that goes NDP every time, or if you're a riding that goes Liberal every time, those parties can pretty much ignore you, and they tend to. And the reason why is that a very small number of votes will flip the election, right? So maybe 3 or 4% shift in the vote from one election to the next could go from one party having all the power to another party having all the power. And how do you do that? Well, you get the voters in a few seats to change their minds, and so these swing seats that swing back and forth between the two major parties, those are the ones that they covet. So when they're designing their policies for the election, their policies that target those 6 or 8 or 10 ridings that flip back and forth.
Right. So arguably, you could say that the nixing the tolls on the Lower Mainland Bridge might be considered kind of political gamesmanship.
Absolutely. It's unlikely that policy would have had as much attention and as much prominence in that party's platform if it not for the fact that they had identified that they could flip 4 or 5 seats, and 4 or 5 seats is a gigantic flip, even though we're talking out of a large number.
I'm kind of conscious of time here, so I do want to think about if we can get a bit of an understanding what we're actually comparing here. Like, what does the legislature look like? What does our government look like now versus what we're hoping to achieve out of a proportional system, or what the advocates for PR are talking about?
Yeah. Well, what we have now is we have a pre-election coalition system. And what I mean by that is the BC Liberal Party is a coalition party. The BC NDP is a coalition party. The NDP, when they created the party back in the 1950s, they said, we're going to be a coalition of labor and farmer and socialist. So they were very open about it. The BC Liberal Party is a coalition of social conservatives and fiscal conservatives, and so they create these grand big tent parties, these unite the right parties, these unite the left parties, these big coalitions ahead of the election. And it's done in secret, in back rooms, etc. For the most part. After the election, under a PR system, after the election, the coalitions are formed. And there's some public discussion. You get to see the coalition form, and I think that's better.
It's a whole lot more transparent, if you ask me.
Absolutely. And so what happens now is generally, you usually have a majority government. You occasionally have a minority government, but the coalition was formed in advance. The coalitions were formed in advance. Now the coalition, you would usually have a minority government. You might occasionally have a majority government, and then the coalitions would be formed after the fact. So it's virtually the exact same process, it's just reversed.
Right.
And I would argue a bit more transparent.
Man, I tell you, I could talk to you about this all day. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But this is a segment that I hope to be carrying forward as the months progress towards the referendum, and I hope to have you on again.
Wonderful.
This has been amazing. Thank you very much for joining us, Stephen. I'm Kalen Harris, and this has been another segment of Voting for Change. Thanks for joining us.
Well, since we taped that first segment, we've now learned from the Attorney General of BC, David Eby. He's filed a report on what we heard from British Columbians on the question about the referendum process, what the ballot should look like, the questions that should be asked, when will it start, when will the votes actually be counted. And he's recommending to the government that there be a two-part question. And in the first part, the question will be a simple, do you support continuing to use the first-past-the-post voting system that we use, or are you in favor of adopting a version of a proportional representation voting system? That's the key question that the government has said that will need that 50% plus one threshold to then go to the second question, which asks British Columbians, if you are in favor of some form of proportional representation, what would you support? And the ballot that the Attorney General is recommending is identifying three particular options. One is what's called a dual member PR system. Second one is what's called a mixed member or multi-member PR system. And the third is a rural-urban PR system. Now, there are details on what these systems may involve in the Attorney General's report. The Elections BC organization is going to be asked to provide more factual information to British Columbians about the details and the options and the values involved in each of those three choices so that the public can be better informed. We will use our show in the coming months to dig into those details a bit more to provide more information and what the implications may be of one system over the other. So those are the ballot questions we now know being recommended by the government. We know that the campaign will start July the 1st. We also know that the actual voting time will start 2 days after the municipal elections. So people will go to their city halls or municipal election campaigns to vote by October 20th. The referendum for the voting reform issue starts 2 days later and will run through to the end of November. So there'll be plenty of time for discussion and debate and further information and an opportunity for British Columbians to receive their mail-in ballot, think about it, complete it, and send it back in, all being run by Elections BC. And so we've got a broad sense of the outline of what the campaign will look like and what the options are. And so in our coming shows, we'll be speaking to a variety of representatives from the major political parties in BC and other experts and specialists to help you decide whether you are voting for change. And in our next show, we'll be speaking with Sonia Furstenau, Green MLA representative of Cowichan Valley, and she'll be in the studio to speak with Laurel and I about PR and the Green Party's position on voting reform. Thank you very much.